here is two things. One, I want to kind of give us a sense of the property tax as a system. And then secondly, I want to talk more in depth about the particular forest law that gives partial relief from the assessment, ergo your taxes, on forest land if you meet certain requirements. But I don't want you to think that I'm pushing what's called Section 488 of the Real Property Tax Law, because that's only one thing to do, and it's kind of, in my estimation, it's sort of a last resort. There's other things I think you can do to try and get your taxes down. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot about assessment, because the value that's placed on your property is one determinant of the taxes. However, let's assume that everything's wonderful and perfect in your town, village, wherever you live, wherever your woodlot is, and everything's done perfectly, and you have the most wonderful assessor in the world, which I happen to have also in my town, which is right over here, the town of Salina. And everything is wonderful, but still your taxes are high. Why might that be? Yeah, local governments need revenues to plow the streets. School districts need to pay some sort of a living wage to the teachers. I don't want to get in an argument as to whether or not they're paid too much or not. But anyway, we need to have a certain amount of revenues. And so when all is said and done, even under the tax abatement law, or if you're a farmer and you happen to be in an ag district, after all is said and done, your taxes might still be quite high. Okay, where do governments get their revenues? Well, the state gets it mainly from income tax and sales tax and fees, and the federal government depends increasingly on the income tax. The county gets it from revenue sharing with the state, with sales taxes, and from the property tax. And so we see the property tax showing up here. The towns, villages, they get it from revenue sharing from the county sales tax. They also get some revenue sharing from the state, but they also get it from the property tax. In fact, the property tax is the main source of revenue for local governments. We may not like that, but that's the way things are, and it's the way things are probably going to stay for quite a while. Increasingly, we have state mandates that require the towns do certain things, and yet there's no more funding given for those, and that is changing, and now it seems as though if the state is mandating a certain requirement on the local school district or the local town, because school districts are like the local towns also. They depend heavily on the property tax. And so what I say will pertain to both of these units. Increasingly, though, we're seeing that the state is building in revenue sharing if they are mandating something. But that's not a guarantee. Okay, how does the property tax get set? The first thing, and the thing that I'll be talking about in the next slide, first thing is to assess the properties. Go out, actually that's a very involved process in that. The first thing they've got to determine is where are the properties, who owns them, what are the property descriptions. So we run into things like tax maps, identifying owners of parcels of land, and then going out and actually establishing a value on each one of those properties. After assessing it, and you know how much real property value you have in the town, next thing, or usually coincident with it, is to set a budget for the year. How much money does the town need or want to run the government that year? How much does the school district need or want for next year? How much of that revenue can they get from the property tax? Or do they want to get from the property tax? They get, as I said, they get revenue sharing, particularly school districts get revenue sharing. They're not sure how much they'll get. Towns, villages get revenue sharing from the county sales tax, but they're not sure. Deciding how much revenue to get from the property tax base also involves political factors. They don't want to raise the taxes too much because they won't get elected again. So it's a complex situation, and having been involved in that, I do have some sympathy with our town and school officials. Then they set a tax rate. How much for every $1,000 of value, how much, what percentage of that will they collect in taxes? And so you'll see on your tax bill the tax rate. And it's usually expressed as dollars per $1,000 of tax per $1,000 of valuation. Calculate the tax per parcel, and then, of course, what they do is, the next thing is to go out and collect the tax. And hopefully we all pay our taxes, even though we may not like it. All right, let's go into a little bit more on property assessment for taxes. One of the things that's used here in New York State is the principle of highest and best use. Now, this is a really complex term, and I'm not going to spend hours on it. But what it means is the tax assessor can go out and look at a piece of property and say, what is going to be the, I won't say highest and best, what's going to be the most likely use of this property? Somewhat related to that is comparable sales. What have parcels of land that look like this sold for? What kind of use have they sold for? And what has been the selling price per acre? The tax assessors, most tax assessors, use these two things together in coming up with a value of the property. Related to that is something called current use. This is a little bit different from highest and best use. And tax assessors are encouraged to use this idea, to take a look at a piece of property and say, what is the current use of that property and how much value should be placed on that? Now, supposing you own a piece of forest land and it happens to be in one of the suburban towns here around Syracuse. Just the other day I was driving up to Great Northern Mall and I saw a piece of forest land here that was having an active logging job on it. Obviously the current use for that is in timber management. But here it is in the town of Clay. If any of you are familiar with Onondaga County, the town of Clay is one of the fastest growing suburban towns in the county. What's the tax assessor likely to do when he looks at that parcel of land, even though there's a logging job going on it? He's liable to say, hey, that's going to go into housing, and I'm going to assess that as building lots. It may not be completely legal. The owner can go and file a complaint and say, hey, you can't assess me based on what you think I might be doing. You should assess me on what's actually happening. But we go back and forth between this. Why? Because the tax assessor is under pressure to get property values up and to collect the taxes. That's what his mandate is. Your mandate as a property owner is to try and keep your taxes down. one of the things we need to recognize is this thing called partial versus full value assessment. If the law, again in New York State, says we have to assess land, property, houses, real estate on it, forests, at full value. What that means is the value should be set at what a willing buyer and a willing seller can agree on as a price, i.e. the market. What the market is currently selling comparable properties for. And that's what the value should be that's set on that. There's a couple problems with that. One, these values fluctuate from year to year. We've just come out of a period when residential properties were depressed in their values. That's also affected the general economy, affected the value and the sales of forest land and commercial property and industrial property. So the values change from year to year. Here you've got an assessor who maybe has a staff of one person in some rural towns, may have a staff of 2 or 3 people in a suburban town, and they have to go out and value each parcel, which may be thousands of parcels, pieces of property in your town every year. So they tend either not to do that, or they do it one time and they leave it at that value levels for many, many years. As we'll see, it really doesn't make any difference if you're at partial or full value assessment, except that it makes people feel better. Psychologically, people tend to feel better if their property is assessed at only $17,000, and they know they could sell it for $150,000, but it's only assessed at $17,000. It doesn't make any difference because what's important is how your assessment compares to other similar parcels. If this is yours and there's a woodlot and it's assessed at $17,000, if this guy's got a piece of property, he's got this big house on it, and he's assessed at only $20,000, hey, we got a problem. But if he's assessed at $50,000 and you're assessed at $17,000, even though he could sell this maybe for $300,000 and you could sell this along with the rest of it for $120,000, you're okay. Because it's the relative assessment. Remember, the tax assessor sets the tax rate. And so what's important is how your assessment compares to other similar parcels. How can you find that out? Well, it varies a little bit from town to town and more importantly from county to county. Many counties now have the tax rolls all on the computer and they are open. In Onondaga County here, you go to the website www.ongov.net, and from there there's a menu and you can click onto the real property, and for a particular town you can find out what it is. The other thing you can do is you can go to your tax office and you can demand to see the tax rolls. They don't have to make them available for you at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, but at certain times during the year, those tax rolls are all there and they're open. I know because I've used them from Essex County to Allegheny County to Dutchess County. And they're there, and you or I or anybody can go in there. If I know this gentleman's name, and I know the town his property is located in, I can go down there and I can see what his assessed value is on his property. and I can see whether or not he's got an exemption because he's a veteran or a fireman, or he's got an exemption for farmland or something like that. So that information is available to you. And it's one thing I think people should do if they feel their taxes are too high. Why? Because if the taxes are too high, then one of the things what happens? We're supposed to be plugged in here. Okay, what's important is how the assessment compares to other similar parcels. All right, what do you do if you feel your assessment is too high? Well, the first thing is, I would talk with your assessor. How many of you ever talked with your tax assessor? Great. Have they been sympathetic to your cause? Well, they got a job to do, but that's the first thing that I would do. The next thing you can do is make a formal appeal at grievance day. The law of New York State says there will be a grievance day. And there is a board of grievance review people who are people in your town, and they sit and listen to the cases. And if you feel that your taxes are too high, i.e. your assessment's too high, you go and you file a formal complaint. I have never had to go that far with it. I've talked with my tax assessor and gotten some relief that way. You can sell your property or change the use. Now, none of us wants to do that. And that's one problem with the assessment of forest land, is it forces people to either sell their property or take it out of forest land. Or you can apply for a special tax program. And that program here in New York State is Section 480A of the Real Property Tax Law. So I want to talk more about that. This is a slide that Sloan prepared for me. All right, known as Section 480A of the Real Property Tax Law. It's been in effect since 1974. And this was enacted to encourage long-term ownership of woodlands for the production of forest crops, which means primarily the wood crops. If you're producing blackberries in your wood's edge, no. But it means basically things that come from the trees. And it exempts the owners from a percentage of the real property taxes on the committed acreage, and involves a landowner, a qualified private consulting forester, the DEC, and the town clerks. How do you get into it? Well, you must have a minimum of 50 acres of contiguous forest land. Now that's important. So if you have some little parcels that are separated by open fields, you don't qualify. You've got to have a minimum of 50 acres of contiguous forest acre in one ownership. You must dedicate this, and we'll get into how you do all this, to the production of forest crops and be able to produce one within 30 years. Now this has had some arguments along with it, because the law doesn't say what a forest crop is. And I got into an argument with one of the DEC foresters saying that on a particular woodlot that I was asked to consult on, they could produce firewood. And that's a forest crop, certainly in today's economy. And he said, no. Well, we finally solved it. Any timber harvested conducted within 3 years prior to application must have been conducted as prescribed by a sound forest management plan. So that's an important consideration.
Should they tell you what forested land is?
Okay, yeah, I think I'll answer that question. That's a good question. Who may apply? Any individual, trust, estate, partnership, association, firm, private corporation, industry, or any other private legal entity that owns eligible forest land. government entities are excluded. Well, how do you sign up? The landowner, first of all, has to hire a qualified private consulting forester to prepare a forest management plan for the property. With a map that shows the location of the property and an application submitted to the DEC forester. This plan is a very specific management plan. It has to describe the property, not only the boundaries, but subdivide the property into what we call different compartments. Let's say you've got some white pine saw timber in one area, and then over here you've got some hardwood pole timber that grew up on an old pasture, and over here you've got some mixed northern hardwood saw timber. All of those areas have to be identified on a map, and the stocking levels, that is to say, what's the volume, what's the number of stems per acre. So there's work that the forester has to do in terms of inventorying your property to prepare quite a detailed management plan. Looking at the soils, what is the productive capability of these? Is this area that's in a hardwood pole timber that grew up on old pasture 30 years ago, is that capable? Is it site physically capable of producing wood crops within the next 30 years? And then they have to write a prescription for each one of these areas. What is the prescribed treatment for that white pine saw timber? Maybe it's a partial cut right now. Maybe it's, if it's white pine and you want to get white pine in again, it would be a heavy shelter wood cut. So, because white pine needs a lot of sunlight to come up underneath white pine. What is it for the northern hardwoods? Maybe it's a pre-commercial thinning to remove some of the beech or something. So all of these things have to be developed, and that forest management plan, of course, would not be developed by the consulting forester without your input. The two of you have to work together on what do you want to do. But keep in mind, we're tying ourselves to a particular plan, and this has to be submitted to the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the forester will take a look at it and see whether or not it meets the criteria. The application is complete and acceptable. You get a certificate of approval, and an initial annual commitment form must be submitted to the town clerk and the assessor. And now you get basically a lien on the property for 10 years, and every year an annual commitment form must be filed when the land is committed for that year and the following 9. So it amounts to a rolling 10-year. Let's say here in the year 2013, we've done our management plan, we get our application in, DEC says, good. Now you sign a form and you say, yes, I will follow this plan, I am bound by it for the next 10 years. 2014 comes around, you've got to sign that form again for the next 10 years. So you're always committing 10 years out into the future. You may not like it, but all I'm doing is describing to you the law. The good news is the exemption will be up to an 80% reduction in the real property tax assessment on the committed acres. It can be up to that much. And how much it is depends on how the assessor views the bare land versus the forest cover on it. So that's partly a judgment call, but the assessors have been pretty good to grant quite a heavy reduction in the real property tax assessment. Now, it depends on, it's possible, but it usually doesn't happen, and you might not save much depending on the equalization rate for the town. What is the equalization rate? Well, if your town is not assessed at full market value, let's say all the parcels in your town are assessed at $1,000, $1,500, $2,000, and there are some towns still in New York that are not at full value, then the state sets an equalization rate to what would be the full value of those if they were brought up. The state does its own assessment, partial. So if your town happens to be very far below full value, you might not save much because it's not going to affect your assessment that much. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But, yeah, like the screaming kitty, your responsibility. Every year you have to file an annual commitment form to get the exemption, and that extends the period of commitment. Property and uncommitted acreage boundaries must be kept painted, so we know where it is. The plan must be updated every 5 years. You have to file a new plan with DEC and then with the town every 5 years. And all work on the certificate of approval must be accomplished as scheduled. So, if you agree and your consulting forester says, yes, that's good, and the DEC approves it and says, yeah, sometime within the next 5 years, there will be in fact, it may even be more specific, 5 years from now, there'll be a shelter wood cut in that white pine. So, 5 years from now, regardless of what the market is, regardless of what your need for cash is, you have to have a harvest cut in that white pine. Now that might be fine. It's going to give you a good stand, but you might want to cut that this year to pay for your child's college tuition. Or you may want to hold off till 8 years for income tax purposes. If you get a big shot of income from your forest land, don't forget you got to pay income taxes on that. And you may want to put that off until you have a year, God forbid, when you have heavy medical expenses. My wife just spent $10,000 on her teeth. So we get a medical deduction this year, I think. And so, hey, I'd be happy, I'd like to cut that white pine this year, because I'm offsetting it with something. So there's a lot of other considerations that go into the timing of a timber sale. But the 488 plan ties you into a specific schedule. It works out okay for some people. There may be a catch. Sometimes changes are made in the plan. The EC has guidelines that mandate scheduling of timber stand improvement work. So the means that trees of little or no value have to be cut at a set number of acres per year. If you can't do this work yourself, it will probably cost you money. So they do, in your prescription, in your plan, there is mandated timber stand improvement work, which has to be done on a schedule. Finally, you may get a profit, marked by a qualified professional forester. And these are all good things that I would encourage any landowner to do. Have a management plan, mark your boundaries, decide on what you want to do. Deal with a competent professional forester. Have a timber sale, not necessarily at a specific time, but when you all both agree it would be good for you. But this mandates those things and locks you into it. And you must submit a notice of commercial cutting to DEC prior to the timber sale, and you're required to pay a 6% tax on the stumpage value to the county. What do we mean by stumpage value? When timber is sold, saw timber is sold, the value of those trees standing in the forest, what a logger, what a wood-using firm will pay for that timber is called stumpage value, as opposed to roadside value, which is a value of the log sitting at the road edge, and that's different from the mill-delivered price, because, of course, we add value as we transform it from the standing forest. But you as the landowner usually get the stumpage value. and you have to pay 6% of that to the county. This is to make up in some way for the exemption that you received. Because you see, if you get an exemption on your forest land, you're not paying the taxes on it. Who's going to pay those taxes? Where is that tax revenue coming from? If it doesn't come from your forest land because you got an exemption, it comes from somebody else's property. So somebody else has to make up for that. And so, sort of to give more equity to it, the landowner has to pay a 6%, what we call a yield or severance tax, when you harvest it. Breaking or being ignorant of the rules is really a bad idea. And Sloan's got an interesting sense of humor. He developed this slide. If you decide to get out, 2.5 years times the back taxes saved, going back up to 10 years, plus a 12% interest compounded. So it's not really a good idea once you get into this thing to get out before it runs out. Now, if you don't sign every year, that means that it's going to run out. So you can wait 10 years after your last signing, and then it'll run out and you're okay. But if you, for some reason, want to get out, or you want to sell the property, and the new owner doesn't want to be bound by that, because remember, you've got a lien on the property now with this agreement. If the new owner doesn't want to have it, then somebody's got to pay these penalties. Partial revocation, yeah, we don't want to do quite what you said. We want to change the timing of something. So there are some options for escape. DEC sends a notice of violation to the county and you pay the fine. Or you stop taking the exemption while continue to follow the management plan until the lien runs out. As I said, you can decide, hey, I've been in this for a few years, I don't like it, my circumstances have changed, my children are growing up, yeah, I'm going to opt out of it. Well, you can just let it run out.
I mean, just a quick comment. This seems like a really bad deal to me. I mean, are people taking this?
Yes. Let me see. I think that's the last one I have in here. Oh, yeah. Because I want to answer that question. The lien is on the property. Remember, on the current landowner, regardless of who is responsible for the violation. Still, mistakes do get made. You can call DEC if you have some problems getting the work done, and there is some flexibility. But it is a complicated thing. It's very involved. When the law was first proposed, and it was one of the main people behind the law was Mike Demery, who was a very important member of the New York Forest Owners Association. Like I bought my first automobile from Demery Chevrolet in Bainbridge. He and Mike and his brothers owned it. Mike was a big tree farmer also. When you get into legislation and laws with the state of New York, I've worked for the state all my career, boy, you get involved in things. Nothing is simple when you're dealing with the state of New York. And everybody wanted to have these certain safeguards built into this thing. We have proposed, when I say we, the Council of Forest Resource Organizations is made up of New York Forest Owners Association, Empire State Forest Products Association, Society of American Foresters, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry at Syracuse, Cooperative Extension, Farm Bureau, the list goes on, Audubon. We have proposed, and DEC is taking a look at it, the idea of having what we call a 480B. And what that means is you agreed to keep your land in forest cover, very generalized, not something that can produce a timber crop in 30 years. If you've got some old pasture, but you're not pasturing it now, it's growing up. All right, you agree to let that stay there as undeveloped land. You won't sell it for houses. you won't go in and strip the trees off and turn it into a cornfield to reap from the ethanol. Just leave it alone. We'll call it 480B. You sign up once, and then 10 years from now, you sign up again, and you have to have a generalized plan, just a general plan that can be drawn up from someone from the Nature Conservancy or from a private consulting forester or from a natural resources conservation service person. You can draw up a general management plan, and for that you get a 50% reduction in your assessment. Simple. Now, of course, you got to remember that all of these exemptions, whether you're a veteran or a fireman or whatever, if I get an exemption on my property and I'm not paying my fair share of taxes by full value assessment, you got to pay more. Because if I pay less, you got to pay more. So another argument is, let's get rid of the property tax and go to sales tax and income tax. Well, it ain't going to happen in New York State with home rule. We're going to have the property tax for a long time. 480A works for some people. We were talking yesterday, and I likened it to, excuse me ladies, I likened it to if you have problems with your prostate. There's a lot of different alternatives. One of those is to have what they used to do years ago with everybody, and that is a radical removal of it. That's like going into 488 right now. There's a lot of other options, though. You can get these radioactive seeds, I guess, or you can do therapy or whatnot. Thank God I haven't been bothered by that by now. But that's kind of what it is. There's lots of other things you can do or try to do before you make a commitment to get into 480A. Some people that have gotten into 480A are unhappy they did. Others are very happy to live with the restrictions. It fits their objectives.
I mean, I'm just thinking cost benefit. So, you know, I get into this regulatory nightmare, number one. And I give up value on my land because I've got a lien on it, and that's going to affect the marketability or my ability to sell it, and so on.
Sure, exactly. It certainly will.
You know, I've got to pay consulting foresters and file papers and do all this stuff, and then I have to let them tell me when I can cut a tree, when I can't cut a tree. All that may be okay in terms of building the timber value, but it might not be. And what's my benefit? Well, I get some tax breaks, but at the end they take it back anyhow because they're going to charge me 6% on the stumpage.
Yeah, but that's really you've got the money to pay for it. You don't have to take away from your child's tuition college payment to pay your taxes. You've got the money in hand from the sale of timber. So that's the argument of having the yield tax, is that the timing of the tax is when you can afford to pay it.
So you're going to pay it anyhow, it's just a matter of when. And you're saying, well, when you monetize your timber value, then you can pay it.
Yeah, and you know, if you own a lot of timberland and you're not a wealthy, you don't have a large income from whatever you do as a job, property taxes can really eat you up. In the Catskill region of New York, where I did a study a few years ago, I found out that the property taxes really ate up 50% of the value of the timber on that property. The property tax. And now you add to that income tax and you add other things. Hey, any rational landowner says either I'm keeping my property because I love it, which he does, or else I got to think seriously about selling this to somebody that's more willing to do something with it than I am.
Clarification, I'm now letting a 480A contract expire. I got to 2014, the end of February is the... And I went to the assessor about 6 years ago after my assessment was raised, and the rationale was, well, we raised all
Yeah.
industrial lot. And I said, look, I've got a woodlot that isn't like my neighbor's woodlot. It's seriously encumbered. I had to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and even though I had 2 blowdowns, I had to pay a forester to get the plan changed so that I could harvest the blowdown. I mean, you've got to jump through a lot of hoops. I said, no way is this property the same per acre as my neighbor's. And she smiled, and that's all I got. Okay, so those of you who get into this program and want to get out and don't want to pay the 2.5 compounded at 12%, only the state can get 12% on top. You don't have to settle for less than 1. Anyway, you're going to buy out. To buy out, and if you want to buy out 10 years, you can sell the property and you won't get enough for the buyout.
No, right, because that's right.
Compounding, and so be very careful about getting into this. And as far as stumpage, I never saved any money because I paid more in stumpage than I saved in taxes. And you say, well, my neighbor's house is here and my woodlot is here. Well, I get nothing of value from his house. If you read some literature, he gets a world of value from my woodlot.
Well, yeah.
Sequestering and beauty and iguan forever. Does he pay me anything? No. So anyway, that's my.
Those are all very valid issues, I would say.
One more. The radical, maybe even our forest owners would propose a very radical situation. You said a guy has to get reelected. How about we have now taxation without representation? That's an old phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
I own land in several jurisdictions. I only voted for one.
Yeah.
So the assessor can run wild, and I can't do anything. So we ought to propose that. Go ahead, I've taken it.
The short answer is come to my last session this afternoon where the topic's going to be dealing with the legislators. But let me move on. The gentleman in the back has his hand up. Yes, sir.
If you haven't reached the tipping point on 488, this may do it.
If you have one?
If you haven't reached the tipping point on 488, this may send you over the edge on it. One thing that I talked to my consulting forester about going into this, and one of my major objectives, like a lot of forest owners, is wildlife enhancement. I have an abandoned apple orchard. I cut down the black cherry trees because I want the apples.
Yeah.
I let the grapevines grow. I've got 3 wildlife ponds. And you're in real trouble with that. It is forest product, period.
Yeah.
But he was hopeful, and this may be the 480B, that Vermont, I think, is a state that has a much more charitable situation for the landowner, and he was hoping that was going to change.
Yeah. A number of states have those. Will we get one in New York? I think we will. Will we get it in my lifetime or your lifetime? I'm not sure. But I think that this kind of is a segue into, as I say, I'm on again as the speaker the last thing this afternoon, into getting the message to the legislators. Legislators in New York State are concerned about a whole raft of things. Forest values, forest taxation, keeping the land in forest, unfortunately, is not up here for them. It tends to be down here. Even for people like Assemblyman Pat Ritchie, who's Senator Pat Ritchie, who's a strong advocate of forest, and even for Will Barkley, whose area is up here in Oswego County. Other things tend to occupy their minds. So I think we as forest landowners need to have our voice heard. We need to get out there just as much as all of the other groups, maybe not protest as ugly as some of them, do it in a more refined manner.
You mentioned where you had a cow pasture and maybe it's been void for about 30 years, so it's gone back to brush or whatever.
Yeah.
At what point does it become a, quote, a forest versus a brush lot? And secondly, in our area, over in Hugh County, A lot of the quote brush that comes in is buckthorn,
Yeah.
which is a major, as you probably know, nuisance.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Again, the key is this area going to produce a forest crop in 30 years, which a lot of the foresters tend to think of as sawlogs. But firewood from as a major crop could be a possibility. Not if the firewood happens to come out as incidental when you're cutting down some of those old apple trees. No. So, if your woodlot looks like this one here, which happens to be a scene from Beaver Lake, this would qualify. This is an old, was an old cropland actually out here at Beaver Lake, and it's grown up, but this is going to produce timber in 30 years, so that would be eligible. Would an area that's covered presently by buckthorn or tag alder qualify? Probably not.
So that would be referred to as a brush lot with lesser value, though,
Yeah.
or should be.
It isn't a qualification up to the DEC Forestry.
Well, a DEC forester would be the one that would make the call, and if your consultant forester can make a strong case
Yeah,
for
we're
it.
still at the DEC Forestry.
Yeah.
You're still at the whim
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah. Hopefully, if he was one of my students, he's an enlightened one. Yeah. But,
Does this program get a little bit out of kilter with the emerald ash borer and stuff like that, and you got a woodlot that's high in ash?
you can get an exemption for things like that, yeah. Or if you have a fire, something like that. Now, if you have a personal tragedy, hey, like I said, my wife just spent $10,000 on her teeth. You could use $10,000. That's kind of hard. But if it's something that happens to your forest, you're more likely to get relief and exemption. So the emerald ash borer, in fact, that question has been raised, and the answer has been yes, probably.
Didn't this gentleman just say though, to do that, he had to pay to get it?
Oh yeah, you've got to pay them to
Consulting
get.
forester to revisit.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Go through
Oh,
it.
yeah.
And I know when I looked at it, the cost of the consultant forester would offset the cost, the 80% cost.
There you're in a dilemma. I harvested maybe $3,000 and I paid the forester, well, he took his 20%. So it was better than leaving it there. You can't leave it there anyway. But
Yeah, but you have to pay not talking about the timber sale, but you pay the consultant forester for the plan, which is a totally separate issue.
Right.
You'll be paying the $3,000 that you got at a timber sale just to get the plan you need.
Well, he sort of threw it in and said, we got 11 acres to blow down, bring the DEC guy over, show him, he said, yeah, sign off on the change, and away we went.
I want to cut this off. This has been great. I welcome you all to come. We got to keep on schedule, and